Nothing that I would consider permanent, because nothing's been made into what would be captured under a modern treaty, which would then be constitutionally protected. So these agreements might be able to become convention, based on past practices, but they can be canceled too.
So if they're under convention, are they still able to be canceled?
It's debatable. So, for example, I'm not somebody that's a descendant from Treaty 6 signatories. My son is a descendant of Treaty 6 signatories. And Treaty 6 is very special because it's got the medicine chest clause, the famine relief clause, it's got education. And to interpret that in a modern sense, we understand that as post-secondary education, covered by the federal government, healthcare. And healthcare is a treaty right, but is not necessarily guaranteed through treaties and different agreements broadly across Canada, but that's been applied across Canada and continues in his convention. So an argument could be made that, it would be breaking convention to, cancel these agreements, but that would be up to the courts to decide, basically.
Yeah, interesting. So it's just going through the courts some more is basically what it is. Yeah.
You spend a lot of money in the court system.
If anybody has any questions, on the right of your screen, you should see a question and answer portion. Just type in your question in there and make sure it's to all or to myself, Charlene LaValle, and then I can see your question, and then I can read it to Rebecca if it's sent directly to me. So I guess one of the things, and of course the victory in the case was after Harry had passed away and his son had passed it on. But it's interesting that it really accomplished a lot across Canada, and there's the government hasn't made a move on it really, and neither have any of the Indigenous agencies. There's so many non-status and off reserve that are unrepresented, and I guess that's one of the reasons why we went back to AMNSIS as well, is because then at least we're able to represent the off reserve, because off reserve, I've got a daughter-in-law who's from Alberta, and she's from Sturgeon Lake Reserve out by Grand Prairie, and there is no help for them in Saskatoon. Like, they're a province away, and so yet they have this, the same benefits that somebody on reserve should have, but they can't access half those benefits. And that's the same thing with, like Jordan's Principle. Trying to access a Jordan's Principle worker off reserve is pretty difficult as well.
Well, one thing I just want to draw attention to, because we talked about this a little bit the last time we gathered, one was portability and another was the idea of government distinctions, right? And I want to look at this for a second, because it was mentioned last time and then came up today, the idea about how there was no need to do certain declarations in the court decision, basically because, by being made Section 9124 constitutionally recognized people, that created almost a de facto situation for other protections like fiduciary duty and things like that. And I think that that's interesting because it illustrates that in reality, you can look at rights and understand that there are going to be different groups that sign different agreements. There's going to be different treaties. Here in Southern Ontario, there's lots of little treaties that were signed with, and not far from here were some of the precursors for the numbered treaties out west. And what comes from them is the fact that it's like, yeah, every group's going to have different agreements, but we don't, the distinctions are all constructed based on outside ideas, you know, because so many of us are intermarried with First Nations people, or, you know, different groups of Métis people, because you might have some people from the South that strongly identify as road allowance Métis people who, you know, get together with somebody from the North, and that's a different cultural, there's different, there's different cultures between, you know, some of the Prairie Métis and the Northern Métis and stuff like that. And I mean, you look at Métis in Northwestern Ontario that have treaty rights, you know, so it's not cut and dried. Everything is really based on other people's distinctions and not how we actually relate to each other.
And that always seems to be a big problem. Like, I don't know why the government just doesn't sit down and say, you know, it's we need to be inclusive and talk to the Indigenous population, and because it is all kinship. We are all related, you know, when you get down to the nitty gritty of it. So yeah, that is a really, really frustrating part. And right now there's so much stuff going on social media and in about who isn't Indigenous, and we got a whole call out society going on, and calling, you know, out on a very public format and saying that people aren't Indigenous, and it's worse than sandbox antics. It's just horrible, the stuff that's going on social media. I've just been staying off of Twitter because it's not nice, and what they're doing to people isn't nice, and it's really too bad. So we had a meeting for the Congress of Aboriginal People for the all the provincial territorial organizations, and we were talking about the legalities of some of the things that are going on, and how some groups are being left away from the table, and it always seems to come down to a push and shove between the government, which is really too bad. And I've always said that the government's biggest game is divide and conquer, and you know, as long as they build that animosity, it's, you know, we're not really going to get too far too fast. So, and I guess with AMNSIS, that's our biggest goal, is to try and unite everyone and try and unite the family system. And like, realistically, and we you know, we talked about that in the first show with Saul, that the government's biggest fear is that Indigenous people all join force, because we would be a force to be reckoned with, and we would be a very powerful organization. Idle no more. Look at the movement that they created there, you know, and we just need to remember that we are all related, and it comes down to hand. I know that talking with the lawyers at our legal symposium, was that there is some movement in trying to obtain the rights that the status have for the Métis and the non-status in regards to health and things like that. So that would be very beneficial if that did happen. Like, there's, you know, sometimes that health bill can just kill a family, especially when they start getting into pension and stuff like that. Our poor pensioners, they live on a fixed income, and then they've got medical bills and these are medical bills. Like 40 years ago, we had way better Medicare than we do now.
Yeah, and the thing is, there's coverage for Inuit, and Inuit got this distinction in 1939. So why would you not then apply it to Métis and non-status that got the distinction in 2016 the same way the Inuit did in 1939?
Huh.
Right. And the
Yeah.
only thing that I would, you would have to be cautionary over is the idea of the discussion around how communities even understand themselves. So right. I think of my grandmother because I think of the fact that, so when I was a kid growing up, I've been thinking a lot about this recently. When I was a kid growing up, I didn't know that being Native was being different because I was around a lot of Native people. We talked about being Native, and it was like there were so many different colors of us within that capture. I didn't think of it as like an ethnicity thing, so to speak. And then, I got to be a young, dumb teenager and adult that didn't want to listen to anybody or anything for a few years once I was, 16, 17. And then when I was starting to willing to listen again, at 20, 21, because I had questions about who I was, things were coming up and I started talking to my family. And both sides of my family, it was like, okay, so you're willing to take this seriously now, you're willing to listen. My dad's whole family, the women were the story keepers. My grandma, she was like, we just didn't talk about it, but what do you think? What do you think? This was. She said, but we're half breeds. So she did the good thing and took on her husband's identity as a good wife and all these types of things and learned Scottish country dancing because he was Scottish and supported his Scottish holidays in the home and things like that. And then she was always a very politically active woman, but privately, just like she was about her spirituality. And one day she's talking to me and she underself, she's like, well, I'm an English half-breed. We're from the Hudson Bay. We were never French, but are we Métis? Because she wanted to identify because she was pissed off, pardon my language, at the government. And she's like, this is who I am. This is how I live. I shouldn't have to tell everybody else who I am. But she's like, God damn it. Like, how else is anybody going to listen if we don't all stand up and be counted? Right? And, she knew what our legacy was, but she knew being an English half-breed, how does that fit with the idea of the French Catholic Métis? Because her family was never Catholic. So she had a hard time reconciling that because it's how she understood herself and trying to put herself into that legal distinction, which is now then you take my son who has grown up in the language of Indigenous and Métis and not the, older language even of Aboriginal anymore. And he doesn't use those constructs and it's the same way. So I've really been thinking a lot about this and the growth that I've been for the last 20 years in understanding this, because it's community members that have taken me by the hand and said, okay, I'm going to show you,
I just want to remind people we do have polls that are running on the sidebar. So if you could just take the time to answer those poll questions, it just gives us a little bit of information to work off of. It's really interesting you say that, Rebecca, because we were having a discussion the other day and we were talking about how people identify. We grew up as French-speaking Michif. I didn't know the word Métis until I was 17 years old. We always referred to ourselves as Michif. Years ago, when my grandma was still alive, I was working on our family genealogy. And I said to my grandma, I said, Ma mère, I said, I traced our family all the way back to Scotland. We're not Scotch. and I kind of looked at her and I like, well, yeah, it's right here. Like you're an Arkand, Mackay. Those are all, from the islands. That's who you are. And she says, no, we're not those English half-breeds. And it was really, like I kind of chuckled at it, but I didn't realize what it all meant. And so as I got older and I started reading, the government wants us to fit into one organization and be, you know, all these Métis in this organization. But they don't understand that our history has never been a united organization. There was always the English half-breeds and the French Métis. And then, if that wasn't divisive enough, then you had the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church, and they had their preference. The HBC preferred the French half-breeds over, I think it was, I don't remember. Anyways, they had their preferences over whether it be the French half-breed or the French Métis or the English half-breeds. So we've never been a united organization as far as Métis people go. As far as non-status, well, they've been ostracized, but not by their family. The government made them ostracized pretty much. So it's been a legacy of depleting families and breaking down who we are as Indigenous people. You know, I remember having having relatives on the reserve, and it was just, they're your cousins. That's just the way it is. And I've seen what the system can do in regards to, you know, giving titles to people or taking titles away from people. And I think it's been a very derogatory thing that has happened in our organization, with Indigenous people.
So one of my very best friends that passed away in December, she was a strong person in AMNSIS back in the 1970s and early 80s. And she was the first Bill C-31 in Saskatchewan. And that was an ostracizing thing in itself, you know, because she was allowed to go back to her reserve, so to speak, but because of Bill C-31, and when they split the registry with the band memberships, and bands were given, 12 months to start making election codes and things like that, changes if they want them. The government also didn't compensate bands financially for the increased population. So bands were not wanting some of the new membership coming back because you're just spreading resources. And this is also very typical of government, of creating a crabs in the bucket situation where instead of, shoring up money for growth, we saw that with the treaty land entitlement in Saskatchewan, where you got to get equity acres with your shortfall acres because there was acknowledgement of growth of population, but they didn't do that with Bill C-31 when there was new people going to the reserve. So that left a bunch of people with lack of access again.
See, I just don't even, to me, that there's so much ethically wrong with all of that. And it's just really, really frustrating that, they will never, ever, and I don't think I've ever witnessed a case where they've ever stood up and done what they're supposed to do without basically having to go to court in a lot of cases.
We basically are the only people, we as Indigenous people collectively from coast to coast to coast in Canada, are the only people that have to go to court every time we want to use a right that's already there for us to have.
Right. Exactly.
Madam President, can I get into the conversation?
You sure can, Alan.
Okay. First of all, it was interesting to hear Rebecca say that when the Daniels case was appealed in 2016, they took the word non-status off the case. So it left a lot of people in limbo that were non-status. And as a result, for my first question to you would be, so CAP would only be considered a lobby group because they weren't considered as plaintiffs within after they were taken out in 16. That'd be my first question. Second question I would have is this. the distinction-based approach saves the government billions of dollars. What a lawyer told us when we had our debate on the cases, legal opinions and stuff, he said at that time that the government was reluctant to allow the name non-status to remain in the case because it would have cost the government of Canada approximately $40 billion to take care of all the Aboriginal people in this country. So in that respect, they eliminated about 70% of Indigenous people when they did that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it actually makes me think of a land dispute that's just up the road from where I am right now, because there's a big tract of land with 6 nations that's just through Kitchener-Waterloo. And the government actually owes billions in dollars to the 6 Nations community, just on, you know, rent basically on that land, and they just don't like to pay it. So yeah, the non-status in the appeal process were dropped, and then they were brought back in for the Supreme Court decision, for the final decision, because they were able to appeal and bring them in as plaintiffs again. And so they were able to get the ruling that yes, they are as Indian as Métis people are, and absolutely saving billions on not recognizing non-status people, because they're the first 200-300 years of colonial history on the East Coast is very, very messy. All of colonial history is very messy, but the first, you know, couple hundred years, especially when the French and English were fighting each other in central and eastern Canada, there was not this separation where with the way things happened in the prairie. So like I think about central Canada West and the fact that the government needed to settle title to land to bring settlers in, that, you know, sort of allowed for a system of organization to be created. An administrative organization structure was able to be created through that process. But they didn't start doing that the minute people started interacting for the first couple hundred years on the East Coast. So there's a lot of intermarriage and mixture and everything right up into Ontario. And not everybody got the land or the reserves that they were owed or anything like that. Like when I look at the Algonquin in the Ottawa area, I know that there's debate on who qualifies and who doesn't. I'm not to say who does and doesn't, because that's not the community I was raised in. I'm related to the community, but I don't have a feeling that I have any kind of say in it. The people that started the land claim in the 1970s that wanted to bring in the non-status groups, because of the fact that a large amount of them never went to the reserves with the couple of reserves that were created, it was up to them to bring in non-status people into that land claim. And so they know right there that there are lots of groups that never made it to reserve, or if they were living in communal land, they were, you know, enfranchised in 1869. So they don't want to have to pay for a lot of people that exist. And it's almost as though you see the way that they pick and choose who they want to have relationships with, who they want to fund on, how they can separate people by funding, right? And they make arguments, well, if we let all these people in, you're not going to have as much for healthcare, you're not going to have as much for education, not realizing that people should actually be fighting for what they're owed, not for what they're willing to settle for, right? It's not about making a deal of, okay, well, we're owed, you know, $100 billion, but if we make this deal, we'll have 40 billion now, and so we'll just do it. No, go for what you're owed rather than trying to share with other groups.